We ended A Journey Through Time Part 1 with these ladies enjoying the festivities on Coronation Day in 1937. But the world which Mrs. Emery, Mrs. Lynes, Mrs. Dan, Mrs. Titcomb, Mary Lewis, their friends and neighbours in and around College Street and their fellow Bristolians knew was about to change forever. A unique record of the war that followed was captured on film by Ray Lawrence of M.W. Dunscombe Limited. It's outstanding for its high-quality representation in colour of some of the events that marked the war years in Bristol. At the outbreak of war, the government requisitioned all film for the war effort. However, in 1942, Dunscombe's, a local photography firm, was sent Kodachrome film from Mr. Ernest D. Fear, who lived in Kansas City, Missouri. He'd been born in Chew Magna and provided the film, in part at least, as a means by which he could see how his relatives, still living in the area, and the places so familiar to him, were faring in wartime. The film also seems to have been made with the intention of showing Americans how their men, money and materials were being used in the war effort. Lawrence shot 2 silent documentary films, The Citizens of Bristol at War and The Blitzed City of Bristol. From as early as 1935, a possible war, and a modern war at that, involving the use of air power against civilians, was being discussed and prepared for. Following a government circular, the City Council formed its Air Raid Precautions Committee, and Bristol, like the rest of the country, began reluctantly to prepare for the inevitable. Late 1938 saw the appearance of gas masks, and early 1939 of air raid shelters. At first, everyone carried their gas masks because memories of the terrible effects of mustard gas on the troops of the First World War were still strong. However, as the war progressed, even the attempts of retailers to turn the gas mask carrying case into a fashion accessory couldn't ensure that people always carried their masks with them. And by 1942, the government had relaxed its rules as to the necessity of having to do so. Nevertheless, throughout the war, factories and other businesses held periodic tests of their employees' masks. Here, the police checked those of women factory workers. It was important that the mask fitted properly, and so something was held briefly over the filter whilst the wearer breathed, in order to check that the seal around the face was airtight. Although the feared gases were mustard gas, an arsine, an arsenic derivative, the operators of this mobile Home Office gas chamber are using tear gas for the test, just so they can tell whether the masks are airtight, and the wearers, by being made to take their masks off while still in the gas, are given a mild experience of what it might be like to be gassed. Luckily, gas was never used. In April 1939, the government announced that, in the event of war, the country was to be split into 12 regions. The commissioner responsible for the southwest region was Sir Hugh Ellis, seen here. The key officer in Bristol's civil defence organisation was Mr. H.M. Webb, the city engineer, who was appointed Air Raid Precautions Controller in the spring of 1939. The backbone of ARP was the Warden Service, under the direction of the Chief Constable. The Fire Guard, organised into street fire parties, was formed in 1940 to ensure that fires caused by bombing were reported and the smaller ones dealt with immediately. First aid posts with their own mobile units were set up to care for the casualties of the bombing. The fire brigade came under the Chief Constable and was the responsibility of the City Council until after the heaviest of Bristol's bombing. The start of the Second World War was announced by the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain at 11:15 on the morning of Sunday, the 3rd of September 1939. The city's civil defence provision readied itself, the local territorial army units marched away, and many young people began to volunteer for the armed services. What followed was something of an anticlimax, several months of inactivity known as the Phony War. Then in May 1940, the war came much closer as the British Army was forced back to Dunkirk and France fell to the German forces. The Phony War was over and Britain daily expected an invasion. All able-bodied men between the ages of 17 and 65 were called upon to defend their country, and the local defence volunteers were formed. At first, quite apart from a shortage of weapons, there were no uniforms, and these eager men had to make do with armbands proclaiming LDV. However, gradually things improved, and eventually the Home Guard, as Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, named them, received both arms and proper battle dress, as this film of the 11th Gloucestershire Battalion Home Guard during an exercise in 1942 shows. The 11th Battalion was made up of men from the Westbury, Henbury and Upper Knoll areas. In the early hours of Tuesday, June 25th, 1940, Bristol experienced its first air raids. In 2 attacks, bombs were dropped on St Philip's, St Paul's, St James and Brislington, particularly concentrated on Temple Meads and Lycett's Netham Ironworks at Feeder Road. This German film, though not showing a raid on Bristol, lets us see the attacker side of a raid. Little major damage was done in these first raids, but 5 people lost their lives, 3 of them having come out into the open after mistakenly believing the attack to be over. The actual target, which the Germans were intending to bomb, was the Bristol Aeroplane Company at Filton. It's unclear from the Luftwaffe report of the raid whether they realised that they were wide of the mark. The civil defence personnel came through this baptism of fire with flying colours, proving the effectiveness of their training and organisation. It was their efficiency and devotion to duty during the many raids that followed which the maker of the film, The Citizens of Bristol at War, wished to highlight. It was, however, begun in 1942, when the worst of the bombing was over, and in any case it would have been difficult to film in the midst of an air raid and at night when most attacks occurred. What we see is a reconstruction showing how the various members of the civil defence organisation played their part during a raid. First of all, enemy aircraft would be picked up by Royal Observation Corps posts like this one. There were 4 such observer posts in the Bristol area, at Keynsham, Long Ashton, St Andrews Road, Avonmouth and at Almondsbury, and they were manned largely by veterans of the First World War. Upon spotting aircraft, the post would plot and track their course and pass the information on to the Observer Centre in King Street. This in turn would contact Fighter Command, which would call the Regional Civil Defence HQ at numbers 19 and 20 Woodland Road in Tyndall's Park, and the ARP, Police and Fire Service Control Centres simultaneously. The police had responsibility for the sounding of the air raid siren, an unforgettable, haunting sound described officially as a fluctuating or warbling note which lasted for 2 minutes. There were 4 stages of air raid alarms. Red, being shown here, signified raiders' approach. The civil defence effort would then need to be coordinated. Here, the Deputy ARP Controller, Mr Gibbs, speaks to Chief Inspector Andrews, in charge of Police ARP Control. Conferring with his deputy is the ARP Controller. They now contact the Regional Fire Officer, who will ready his personnel. Meanwhile, the sirens are still sounding, and the wardens are making sure that people reach places of safety before the bombs start falling. In the centre of the city, passengers are ushered off a bus and directed to a surface shelter. Two wardens are making their way along a street in Clifton when the bombs begin to fall. A message is sent of the bomb's location to the nearest warden's post as residents are encouraged to leave their homes and enter the nearest shelter, again a communal surface shelter. The message reaches the warden's post, where there'll be a telephone to pass the information on. Street fire parties were set up to ensure that minor fires didn't turn into major ones out of neglect. The main weapon of the street fire party, or fire guard as they later became known, was the stirrup pump, and there was at least one in every street. The fire party go into action using their stirrup pump to put out an incendiary bomb. A group warden uses a member of the messenger service to pass information of the incident on to the authorities. Fire watchers saved many business premises which found themselves with incendiaries in their roof spaces. It was the lack of a fire guard service which contributed to the dreadful destruction experienced by the historic centre of Bristol during the first blitz of November 1940, since the business premises were locked for the weekend, and even had fires in the roofs been spotted, they would have been inaccessible. A police dispatch rider passes a message to a mobile police station. Incendiary bombs were designed so that should water be applied to them in great quantities, they'd burn all the more, since the magnesium, of which the bomb was made, would combine with the oxygen in the water, thus freeing the hydrogen, also present in the water, to burn in the air. The result was to scatter pieces of burning magnesium. The operator of the stirrup pump's hose had to ensure that he or she hit the bomb with just the right kind of spray so as not to produce this scattering effect which would spread the fire. News of incidents was passed to divisional report centres. These plotted them on a map of their particular division and then sent the information on to the police and fire brigade, as well as deciding which ARP services were required. When the street fire parties and their stirrup pumps couldn't cope with the blaze, then the fire brigade was called in. During Bristol's heaviest bombing, this meant the city's own fire brigade, augmented by its auxiliary fire service, plus brigades from other parts of the country when the home force was beset by too many fires. Unfortunately, the arrival of other brigades could lead to problems, since their equipment might not be compatible with that of Bristol's. It was in order to counteract this and other logistical problems that in August 1941 the fire service was nationalised. In addition to normal water supplies, which often failed when bombs fractured the mains, water was also obtained from the floating harbour, either via land-based pumps or fire floats like the one pictured here operating at the Grove. This is Pyronaut, which was stationed there and can still be seen today at the Bristol Industrial Museum. Firemen demonstrate the technique employed in rescuing casualties from roofs. At times, the fire service was criticised for not fighting as many fires as they might have, but often fire service personnel were diverted from firefighting to saving the lives of their fellow citizens. A group warden rescues someone amidst burning incendiaries. Having reached relative safety, he sends a request for first aid assistance. Right in the centre of the city, around the Wine Street area, and amidst the mayhem of a raid, the incident officer, in the distinctive sash, operates from a central position marked by a checkered flag like a medieval battle standard. He was normally a police officer who coordinated operations, leaving the actual direction to those in charge of the various individual services represented at the scene. A search is made by the incident officer and group warden in the white helmet for casualties amongst the debris left by high explosive bombs. Soon the rescue is in progress as the men from first the rescue party with ropes, picks and shovels, and then the first aid party with stretchers arrive on the spot. They're followed by a messenger clambering over the rubble in order to keep the incident officer back at his incident post informed as to the progress of the rescue. Good communications were vital if all the various civil defence personnel were to operate efficiently. Meanwhile, our particular incident progresses as a casualty is released from beneath the ruins of his home. There now being a brief respite, a YMCA car arrives to provide refreshment for the civil defence personnel remaining at the scene. The filmmaker ensures that we realise where the money to buy it came from. But we must realise the attack is continuing remorselessly. An enemy aircraft appears and again the bombs begin to fall. Meanwhile, casualties arrive at a first aid post. Again, the American connection is made. There were 8 of these spread throughout the city, intended for the treatment of the walking wounded. They were at the Portway Clinic in Shirehampton, Southmead Hospital, the Bristol Royal Infirmary, later at the Eye Hospital, the Central Health Clinic at Tower Hill, the Speedwell Health Centre, the General Hospital, Bedminster Health Centre and the Knoll Health Centre in Broadfield Road. At these were also stationed mobile first aid posts, each staffed with a doctor, a trained nurse and 4 auxiliary nurses, which could set up as dressing stations at actual incidents if necessary. An invaluable part in the city's medical services was played by the St John Ambulance Brigade and the British Red Cross Society, both in terms of the provision of nursing personnel and of training those who'd volunteered or been recruited for first aid duties. Dispatch riders arrive at the Casualty Bureau, housed in the City Council's Public Health Department at Kenwith Lodge, Westbury Park, carrying more names of the killed and injured to be recorded there for the purpose of informing the next of kin. Dr. Parry, who, as Medical Officer of Health, was in charge of all medical services in the city, looks with his colleagues at the latest casualty list, containing, no doubt, the names of those we've just seen rescued and taken off for medical attention. The observers can report that the enemy aircraft have gone at last. The message is passed to the control centre and the all clear sounded. Now the wardens can help people from the public shelters and they can return to their homes. Of course, if this had been a real raid, some of those people would find sadly that they had no homes to return to. At the scene of our incident, the group warden and incident officer can relax, whilst back at the control centre they indicate that the alarm has entered the white stage. That is, that the raiders have passed and all previous messages are cancelled. The attack over, people have to look around and take stock. Gradually, more of those who have taken cover start to emerge. And now we do indeed begin to see that not everyone came out after the all clear to find their homes intact. This gentleman comes out from the cramped conditions of his Anderson shelter to find his house in ruins. These particular shelters were named after the Home Secretary, Sir John Anderson, who ordered them to be designed for people who had easy access to some small area of open land, usually their garden. They were supplied free to manual workers in danger areas and to others earning under £250 a year, considered to be a reasonable middle-class income in 1939. To those with higher incomes, they were available at £7 plus the cost of putting them up. It was discovered they could withstand anything but a direct hit, so it might indeed be possible to lose your house, but survive just outside in the garden, safe inside your shelter. When people emerged from their shelters, they needed to be aware of the situation with regard to the state of the water, gas and electricity supplies, and in many cases where they could go to find food and shelter if their homes were uninhabitable. In order to deal with this problem, Charles McInnes, Professor of Imperial History at the University of Bristol, seen here directing operations, was appointed Emergency Information Officer, and although blind, ran an information bureau for the Ministry of Information with students from the university and older school children, one of whom is donning her Ministry of Information Messenger Service armband. Back at the site of our incident, a member of the 11th Gloucestershire Battalion Home Guard, standing at the corner of what was once Dolphin Street, directs traffic on Wine Street, right in the heart of the old city. In order to get things back to normal as quickly as possible after a raid, the traffic flow had to be restored and people prevented from entering potentially dangerous areas. The Home Guard were called in to help the police in these duties. The work of the bomb disposal, carried out by the Royal Engineers, never seemed to cease as the raids increased in ferocity in late 1940 and throughout 1941. During the attack of November 24, 1940 alone, 337 unexploded bombs were reported, every one of which had to be inspected, even if only 175 of those proved to be genuine. Here in the suburbs, the wardens evacuate the surrounding houses, whilst a bomb disposal squad sets to work to defuse a 1,000-kilo bomb, which we are led to believe has been discovered 18 months after it was dropped. First of all, water is pumped out of the crater. Next, the tail section is removed. Now the mud and ooze are shoveled and bailed out in order to get at the high-explosive business end of the bomb. It's finally discovered, as indicated by a Wellington boot, and it's time for tea. At this point, we might wonder how genuine this event is, since the lady who's providing the tea certainly hasn't been evacuated like her neighbours. The bomb disposal squads were drawn from the Royal Engineers, but they were often accompanied during their initial examination of a suspect device by Clifford Dunning, ARP plotting officer at Bristol, who reported back to the ARP Control Centre. Mr. Dunning was awarded the George Cross in 1941 for having voluntarily taken on such dangerous work, and particularly for his bravery during the heavy Filton raid of the 25th of September 1940. Perhaps either the warden measuring the tail or the gentleman in civilian clothes writing down the details is Mr. Dunning himself. The Luftwaffe dropped a number of different sizes of high-explosive bomb, ranging from 50 kilograms to a huge 1,800-kilo Satan and 2,500-kilo Max bombs. These brave men of No. 7 Bomb Disposal Company, based for the most part at Brislington, took terrible risks clearing the hundreds of unexploded bombs with which the Bristol area was littered during the Blitz. Of course, a real air raid was a much more frightening and unpleasant business, and probably things didn't run as smoothly for the civil defence personnel as the film would have us believe. But nevertheless, it does give us an impression of the dedicated men and women of all ages and backgrounds who work together to do these difficult jobs. What's missing, of course, are the fearful conditions under which they actually had to work. These conditions can be imagined if we try and relive an actual raid. After the first attack in June 1940, bombing continued, although the amount of damage done was relatively small. However, from September, the raids became heavier when Hitler realised he'd lost the Battle of Britain and would not be in London on the 15th of August, as he'd boasted. Angered, in addition, by the RAF's first attack on Berlin, ordered by Churchill as an answer to what was seen as indiscriminate German bombing of British cities, culminating in the accidental bombing of London for the first time on the 24th of August, Hitler directed that the RAF at its bases no longer be the prime target, but rather the industry and populations of large cities. He announced, when they declare that they'll attack our cities in great strength, then we will erase theirs. Bristol found out exactly what this meant on the morning of the 25th of September, when 168 high-explosive bombs were dropped in 45 seconds on the Filton area in an attack on the Bristol Aeroplane Company's works. 6 shelters full of people at the factory were hit with devastating results. In all, 382 died as a result of the raid. As if this was not bad enough, on the evening of Sunday, November 24th, the city experienced what soon became known as its first blitz. The Luftwaffe was now concentrating on night attacks, having suffered heavy losses on its daylight raids. That night, Bristol was the target as 134 German aircraft bombarded the heart of the old city over a period of about 5 hours. A German airman noted that, with Bristol still 50 miles away, he could see a huge fire glow. When he actually reached the city, he found the sight quite breathtaking, with scattered clouds reddened by a massive sea of fire incessantly sprinkled with exploding high-explosive bombs. He commenced his bombing run at 7:45 p.m., by which time the attack had been going on for more than an hour and still had another 3 hours to run. He could still see the fires from the south coast as he returned to base. It would be hard to better the description of the scenes which followed the raid given by Professor McInnes in his book, Bristol at War. The last enemy plane quitted the scene of destruction shortly after 11 p.m. and the all clear was given before midnight. So the crump of high explosives was ended, but the crash of falling houses, the hoarse shouts of firefighters and the roar of the great conflagration continued. People emerged from their shelters to stretch their limbs, to breathe the acrid air and to behold their city swathed in flames. Before dawn, many of the fires were extinguished and weary men were able at last to snatch a few minutes' rest and refreshment. In the relative silence that thus ensued, the desolation seemed complete, but it was intensified when at last dawn came. Save for the dull sound of subsiding masonry, the disconsolate drip of water where firefighters had been at work, and the moaning of the wind through the blackened and distorted remains of what had so recently been fashionable shops and historic buildings, the place was like a city of the dead. Here and there tongues of flame would suddenly shoot out and as suddenly disappear. Everywhere there was the pervasive, unforgettable smell of a great fire, and a heavy pall of smoke covered the city as a blanket might be drawn over the face of a corpse. For many people who walk through the almost unrecognizable remains of familiar streets that dismal morning, the most vivid recollection will always be that of broken glass. Broken glass was everywhere. It lay so thick in the streets that people seemed to be wading through it as they passed along. It lay thick on garden paths and flower beds. It festooned walls and gateways and stuck out in jagged points from pools of water. That night, 200 people were killed, which, though dreadful, was not as bad as might have been expected, since it was a Sunday and many of the people who would normally have been in the city centre were at home. Clearance work began and the reported 337 unexploded bombs were dealt with. Bristol had been badly hit, but the assertion in a German newspaper that, as a distribution centre and important railway junction, Bristol has been wiped out was simply not true. Still, with no gas or electricity and well over 1,300 homeless, morale was low, and rumours, mainly unfounded, of the inefficiency or incompetence of the authorities circulated. The raids continued throughout the hard winter of 1941, which was so cold at times that the firemen's uniforms froze to their bodies and the water turned solid in their hoses. The last major attack came on Good Friday of that year and was witnessed by the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who was forced to wait in a train on the outskirts of the city whilst it was in progress. Early the next day, he inspected the damage for himself. His presence was not appreciated by some of the bystanders who blamed the government for their predicament. Churchill, as the leader of that government, got the sharp end of their discontent and was booed. Bristol was at its lowest ebb, but fortunately it was not to be raided with the same ferocity again, due to the Luftwaffe having to turn its attention to the upcoming invasion of Russia. However, one last tragic incident should be mentioned. At 9:30 a.m. on Friday, August 28, 1942, a lone German aeroplane appeared in a cloudless blue summer sky and dropped a single bomb which fell on Broadway near the junction with Philadelphia Street. On the spot were 3 double-decker buses loaded with passengers. One was damaged by the blast, the other 2 engulfed in flames. Despite enormous heroism on the part of would-be rescuers, 45 people were killed and 25 seriously injured. This piece of film was taken an hour after the event and clearly shows the extent of the devastation. At the time, Bristolians were furious that no air raid warning had been given and that the aircraft had flown over the city unhindered. But it seems that having been spotted near Bournemouth at 9:15 a.m, it disappeared from Fighter Command's plotting tables, probably because of the tremendous altitude at which it was flying, until reappearing over Bristol at 9:30 and immediately dropping its bomb. It then made its escape at an altitude that the British fighters just couldn't reach. Fearing a new type of weapon, an investigation was carried out, which discovered that although a standard bomb was dropped, it had landed on a car, spraying the buses with petrol. So, with the exception of minor attacks in the spring of '44, ended Bristol's Blitz. In over 70 raids, something like 1,250 people lost their lives, 3,000 were injured, and around 89,000 properties destroyed or damaged. But Bristol survived. The port stayed operational, the production in local aircraft factories steadily increased, and although severely tested at times, civilian morale stayed intact. The Germans considered Bristol the 4th most heavily bombed city in the country during the terrible period August 1940 to June 1941, and for a while in their newspapers referred to it in the past tense. But somehow it was able to live through these appalling times, as we shall see, and emerge to look for a better future. The immediate effects of the Blitz on the people of Bristol were distressing. Bombed out homes, husbands away at the front, children evacuated, and cuts in the supply of essential services all took their toll on the civilian population of the city. Bristol was a very compact urban area, with industry and housing intermixed. Although the general intention of the Luftwaffe was to bomb industrial targets, general poor aiming had the inevitable effect of destroying people's homes adjacent to these areas. It was working-class areas that were worst affected. Whilst the rich could afford to pack up their bags and emigrate to the country, the inner areas of the city were within the target area for German planes. 82% of these families in the city had at least one member who suffered neurosis as a result of the stresses of living in such fearful conditions. The worst was over by the time this film was made in the summer of 1942. In order to counteract the problems, one solution, very much the brainchild of Professor McInnes, who worked for the Ministry of Information in Bristol, was to send families away from the city on holidays to the country. Hinnager Camp on the Duke and Duchess of Beaufort's estate at Badminton was described in a contemporary newspaper account as a place where one of the pleasant sights to see is that of Bristol children at play. Miss Walters, a YMCA worker, is devoting her time to the children's recreation. Most of these youngsters, sufferers in the night raids, are members of the Hinnager League, an association formed by Miss Pole, the commandant. All the children are sun-bronzed and happy, and by the autumn many thousands of them will have enjoyed a good holiday at the fund's expense. Rationing was the responsibility nationally of Lord Woolton, who introduced the phrase "the kitchen front" to describe this aspect of planning for survival. The government was well prepared for the eventuality. Ration books were distributed, and by January 1940 the process was complete. Points were introduced into the food ration books in December 1941. By this time the government were better able to analyse the situation and initiated an element of choice for the individual. The point system had the advantage of changing to reflect the availability or not of a particular commodity at a particular time. Emphasis was placed on importing dried food, since it required less storage space on ship, and under the lease-lend system, the Americans provided commodities such as dried egg powder. All these systems were in place when this film was taken in the summer of 1942. The Food Control Office which Lawrence filmed was at 49 Whiteladies Road in Clifton. Extra rations were available for babies and young children, including fruit juice and cod liver oil. The Kelly's Directory for 1940 helps us to identify the retailers that Dunscan's cameraman filmed as he moved up the Whiteladies Road. Morrell James & Co., bakers at number 132. Lloyd & Son, the fish merchants at 128 to 130. Boots the Chemist at number 114, with its windows replaced after bomb damage. Adjacent was Miss Bertha Connett, the draper. The Home and Colonial stores at 118, F.H. Moss at 120. At 122 was David Gregg, provision dealer. Leonard's footwear shop at 108. E.J. Charlton, greengrocers at 138. Samuel Selman, butchers at number 150. People were encouraged to register with a regular supplier to make the rationing system easier to administrate. Pet food too was rationed during the war. Communal eating, either as a need to feed blitzed out families without proper cooking facilities or to cut down on food wastage, developed in the guise of the British restaurant. At the outbreak of war, it was realised that the normal restaurant facilities were not sufficient to meet demand. A civic catering officer was appointed in Bristol, and in July 1941 the first British restaurant was opened in the unfinished council house on College Green. In total, there were to be 13 of these establishments in the city. Land clearance took place for two reasons, either for timber for telegraph posts and roadblocks, or to create more land for growing vegetables and crops, as here, which is probably on the Ashton Court estate. Making food go as far as possible was a prime concern to the authorities. Collection of refuse from so-called pig bins that was then processed and fed to pigs was a regular feature of wartime recycling. Some of the proposed activities, which never materialized, are shown in this sequence of film, designed to show the processes that would be carried out on food exposed to gas attack. The original title boards that went with the sequence were at pains to point out that only small samples of foodstuffs were being experimented upon, lest viewers got the impression that large quantities of material were being wasted. Like everything connected with response to gas attacks, it was a theoretical demonstration because gas was never used. By 1942, the major danger of such an event had passed. We're left with the suspicion that if such procedures had been carried out, the side effects might have been just as unpleasant as the initial contamination. Recycling in wartime was considered a necessity by the government. The collection of salvageable material started in 1940 under the control of the Ministry of Supply, but metal salvage was under the supervision of the Ministry of Works. Many a fine set of iron railings was cut down to feed the demand for scarce metal materials. The railings around the Wills building of the university were removed in 1942. Across the country, a number of historic artefacts disappeared as a result of this initiative. Bristol lost cannons captured in the mid-19th century Crimean War from the base of the Cabot Tower. Much was a wasted effort, as salvage stock was notoriously underused. It was difficult for the government to keep up the population's interest in the salvage effort. Humour certainly helped, and children were seen as ideal collectors, particularly of paper salvage, which was always the easiest to collect. Book collection provided reading material for distribution to the forces or as a recyclable supply of paper. Twinnell Road in Easton was typical of a working-class district in the city. The War Savings Campaign was run by the government as an extension of the national savings movement that had existed before the war. The scheme was seen as a measure to combat inflation. The War Savings Drive combined a network of local community groups, as this made it possible to save regularly. The poster for a dance at Easton Hall proclaims "Tanks for Attack," which suggests that this was the theme for a particular collection drive. The date for the dance, which was on the 21st of August, suggests that much of this part of the film was shot during that month in 1942. Other dances took place in less formal circumstances, like this lunchtime one on College Green. The authorities relied on the courage of women like Mrs. Dorothy Batt, who rescued 20 people after a Blitz attack and was awarded the British Empire Medal for her efforts. Her role as an ARP warden was only one duty undertaken by women on the home front, however. Women were to be found as bus conductors on a transport system that was badly affected both by bombing and the scarcity of transport as a result of requisitioning by the armed forces. Austerity buses, which could accommodate 40 passengers, were the transport equivalent of utility clothing. Women joined the fire service. And worked in factories making ammunition and aeroplanes. This impressive roll call included a group that made up the majority of women's contribution to the effort on the home front, the WVS, or Women's Voluntary Service. An American who watched the WVS loading up a food trailer remarked that they reminded him of the housewives of a small village preparing a light refreshment for a charity bazaar. This comment reflected the fact that essentially they very much represented Middle England. Their uniform, which they had to pay for themselves, was olive green, topped off with a felt hat. In Bristol, the organisation was extensive. It was responsible for the canteens at first aid posts and ran mobile canteens for the fire, rescue and salvage services and for emergency house repair workers. It also provided mobile canteens for the Home Guard. WVS personnel served refreshments and cigarettes to troops passing through Templemead Station. and amongst their more unusual tasks, provided an escort service for female enemy aliens from Bristol to the Isle of Man. One particularly welcome element to the presence of the Yanks was the food that they brought with them. This whole section of film is peppered with evidence of the contribution that the USA made in this respect. All, of course, an allusion to the fact that the film was being made for an American audience. Food and clothing was sent through the American Red Cross Network distribution system. Other contributions came from people like Cary Grant, the Bristol-born film star, who raised a $5,000 cheque that was sent to the Lord Mayor in February 1942. The relationship between the two nations was generally cordial, at least on the surface. The bonhomie at this garden party, attended by the US Consul Roy Baker, attests to this. Mobile canteens from Australia and Canada, as well as America, overcame complaints about lack of mobile canteen facilities for workers engaged on bomb clearance duties. The Americans were particularly keen on providing comforts for children affected by the Blitz. American financial support contributed to the purchase of a house called Arcadia Bellows, which was a home for children at Cheddar. The evidence from the film suggests that it provided accommodation for girls. It's being visited here by Miss Parsons of Toledo, Ohio, and Mr. N. Mason from Florida. Both were with the American Red Cross in Britain. The man in the civilian clothes is Mr. F.B. Whitaker, who'd actually obtained the Bellows cottages with the aid of American finances. Prior to the foundation of Arcadia Bellows, 2 cottages in Weston in Gordano had been knocked together and turned into a rest home for children who were orphaned or whose homes had been destroyed in the Blitz. This was the original Bellows. The name was coined because one of the cottages had been used as a smithy. A number of little girls clutch Bellows dollies that had been handmade for them by an elderly Bristol resident. Our next scene shows the visit of Eleanor Roosevelt. After meeting the Lord Mayor of Bristol, Alderman Cousins, and the head of the WVS in Bristol, Mrs. Thomas, Mrs. Roosevelt had lunch at the Grand Hotel on Broad Street. She was accompanied by General Davis, the only coloured American general, as he was described at the time, and the man in charge of all the black American troops in the southwest. The Americans segregated black troops from white. White troops had their social club at the Royal West of England Academy on the White Ladies Road. Black troops had theirs in the vacant premises of the Clergy Daughters School on Great George Street. Both were provided for by the American Red Cross. However, it was the positive image of Anglo-American relations that Lawrence was to portray over the next year or two in this film. This ceremony, where the Americans and British exchanged each other's national flag, is typical of such camera work. The ceremony took place on the 24th of April 1943 in the grounds of the Bristol Grammar School. The exchange was intended to represent the solidarity between the towns of America, also named Bristol, of which there were 32 in all. 9 of them were represented in the ceremony, when American soldiers from these American Bristols presented the Stars and Stripes to the English Bristol's Lord Mayor, Alderman Wall. Later in the day, the flags went on display at College Green. Alderman Wall hoped, as he remarked in his speech, that after the war, the 2 flags would be placed in some chosen spot to further cement the friendship between the 2 countries. Independence Day, the 4th of July 1944, was marked by a ceremony at the Henry Washington Memorial in Park Place, Clifton. Henry Washington was a royalist general in the English Civil War who succeeded in capturing Bristol for King Charles. Quite ironic that a republic like America should celebrate a royalist achievement. The significance of the memorial to the Americans was that George Washington, their first president, was supposed to be a relative of this English Washington. Mounted constabulary headed the procession from the point of assembly, the Victoria Rooms, to the memorial by way of Queen's Road and Lower Park Place. Amongst the Lord Mayor's entourage was the Duke of Beaufort and the Sheriff of Bristol, Harold Hosegood. America was not the only nation to be celebrated in this film record of Bristol during the war. Stalin's success against Hitler on the Eastern Front was marked by this impressive parade to celebrate Red Army Day on the 20th of February 1943. Many cities celebrated the 25th anniversary of the founding of the communist state on this day, an irony not lost on the British Communist Party, who had the satisfaction of hearing Conservative MPs praising the exploits of Stalin. By April 1945, the German defeat was imminent, with the Allies racing towards Berlin, and the Prime Minister Winston Churchill felt able to pay his second visit of the war to Bristol. Freedom of the city was conferred upon him in the council chamber of the old council house on the corner of Corn Street and Broad Street, and he was received with such warmth that he responded, "If I were not a hardened warrior, it would have made me blush." He then travelled with the Lord Mayor by open coach to the Wills Building at the top of Park Street in order to confer honorary degrees on Ernest Bevin, his Minister of Labour, and A.V. Alexander, First Lord of the Admiralty, both Bristolians. The enthusiasm felt by the people of the city can be judged by the crowds. Some onlookers even watching from the roof of the Berkeley Cafe opposite the Wills Building. The ceremony took place in the university's Great Hall, itself badly damaged in the bombing, and the colourful robes of the participants, with the sun shining on them through the windows, contrasted strongly with the plain scarred walls, deprived of their panelling and decoration. As a further contrast, in his speech, Churchill recalled that the last time he'd been there, robes had been worn over khaki because the officers of the university had been up all night fighting the fires of the Good Friday raids of 1941. Later, in a letter to the Lord Mayor, he said, "My two visits to Bristol in the war will remain linked in my memory, the first in the dark days and the second on the threshold of victory." Finally, the war in Europe ended, and on May the 8th, 1945, the people of Bristol celebrated VE Day. A newspaper described the scene as the old ceremony, always used to make important announcements in the city, was enacted. Huge crowds in the streets and people poised perilously on bombed buildings heard the relay of the Prime Minister's broadcast outside the Council House. Heads were bared and the great throng stood solemn and silent for a few moments as they joined in the national anthem. Then there were deafening cheers as the city's proclamation coach drew up to the top of High Street and was entered by the Lord Mayor, the Sheriff, the Under-Sheriff and the Sword-Bearer. There were happy smiles and more waving of flags as the Lord Mayor reminded the crowd that the great day has arrived. The Lord Mayor waved at the crowds lining the streets as the coach took him to Old Market, the Haymarket, the War Memorial, College Green and Queen Square, where he repeated his victory announcement. As he travelled around the city, the cheers of the crowds mingled with the ringing of the church bells, which officially joined in the proclamation of the restoration of peace. However, we can see from the faces of some of the crowd in this film that jubilation was tempered with reflection on the previous few years. As Churchill said during his visit the previous month, "We're emerging from 5 long years of physical and mental strain, quite apart from the losses inflicted by steel and fire. We are emerging from that long journey, and I dare say that when it is all over, there will be many who will feel a sudden sense of the spell being broken, of the intense buoyancy being lessened, and will want to rest." Perhaps the last word in our history of Bristol's war should be left to Winston Churchill, who on his visit of April 1945, after reminding his audience that the conflict with Japan was still to be resolved, said the following: "When I last came to Bristol, the war lay heavy upon you. Now these dangers have rolled away thanks to the inventors, the bravery of our fighting men, and the audacity of our pilots, and the way our plans have been made and carried through. You may now devote yourselves to the task of rebuilding, or the planning of rebuilding, and rebuild as soon as large numbers of our people come home from the war to help you." The war had left a legacy of destruction, particularly in the inner city, which took the worst of the bombing. All this would need to be put right. Much talk about reconstruction took place whilst Lawrence was making this film. In the next part of our video journey through the history of Bristol, we shall find out what happened.